Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Tapping into Offender Accountability, using wiretapping in state-level human trafficking cases. Today's program is presented by Equitas and presented by Jennifer Dolly and Sergeant Nick Odenath. My name is C. Ross. I am an administrative associate at Equitas, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. If you have a question during the presentation, please enter it in the question and answer box or chat. We will answer questions periodically throughout the webinar. You are also welcome to contact us directly at any time following today's presentation, and we'll send you contact information during our follow-up. Next slide. Equitas's mission is to improve the quality of justice in sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking cases by developing, evaluating, and refining prosecution practices that increase victim safety and offender accountability. Next slide. As a national training and technical assistance provider, Equitas develops resources, conducts trainings, and offers 24/7 consultations for prosecutors and allied professionals. For more information on Equitas, please visit our website at equitasresource.org. You can also follow Equitas on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. The link to each is available on our website. Today's webinar is supported by the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime. The information presented in this webinar does not necessarily reflect the views of the Office of Victims of Crime. Presenting our webinar today are Jennifer Dolly and Sergeant Nick Odenath. I will now turn it over to Jennifer and Nick.
Good morning. Thank you so much, C. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And as C said, please feel free to put any questions in the chat and we'll try to address them as we go along. I am an attorney advisor here at Equitas. And again, just want to reiterate that we are definitely a resource to utilize if any questions come up in the future. We can do all sorts of different legal research and consultations for you. So please feel free to reach out. Our contact information will be at the end of the slide, both myself and Nick. And you will be receiving a copy of these slides too as after the presentation. So prior to becoming an attorney advisor at Equitas, I was a prosecutor in Manhattan for a little over 11 years, where I worked on all sorts of different types of crimes, but ultimately focused in on crimes of sexual violence, domestic violence, and really focused on human trafficking. I helped to build our human trafficking response unit and was the deputy chief of that unit, where I supervised a bunch of other attorneys, a social worker, investigators, and a bunch of analysts and a data scientist. So that was kind of what our unit was comprised of, and prosecuted a lot of these cases. So happy to be here with you all today. And kind of with Nick, kind of share our knowledge about how you can use wiretaps in human trafficking cases and how they can be really kind of a helpful tool. But yeah, it's really just the beginning of a conversation. So, Nick.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Equitas for hosting this event. Again, my name is Sergeant Nick Odenath, and I am a 21-year veteran with the Ventura County Sheriff's Office in California. We're located just north of Los Angeles County, and I have about 5 years of human trafficking investigation with the Ventura County Sheriff's Office, and I'm also a task force liaison for the Enhanced Collaborative Model Grant, federal grant, and work very closely with a number of the task forces throughout the United States. What I hope to bring today is the law enforcement perspective as it relates to wiretap investigations. I really encourage questions because I know a lot of you that are on are probably looking into going into wiretap investigations or considering it and may have some unique challenges. And I know Jen and I are happy to address any questions that you may have as it relates to wiretaps. And so with that, I'll pass it back off to you, Jen.
Yeah, so today we're really, we are going to kind of our objectives are to really kind of talk about building an investigation that would be sufficient to support an application for an eavesdropping warrant, but really kind of talk about how that investigation can be applicable to building a really strong case, even if you don't ultimately end up deciding to apply for an eavesdropping warrant and go that route. We're going to talk about those legal requirements because these are kind of, pretty technical, but the legal requirements, once you break them down, are really kind of straightforward. But there are some pretty strict legal requirements as you apply for a wire, while you're on a wire, and then after you intercept those communications. So we'll talk about what some of those legal requirements are and just things to look out for. And then we're going to talk about how you can litigate pretrial motions to really make sure you're admitting those out-of-court statements, because everything you intercept over the wire is going to be an out-of-court statement. And so making sure that everything you're doing along the way is going to pave the road for that. And then talk about using expert testimony and when and how that can be really helpful. So Nick, what is an eavesdropping warrant, just in its most basic form?
Yeah, I mean, just practically speaking, a wiretap or eavesdropping warrant is the ability to listen to conversations involving the suspects in your case that you have probable cause to believe, in this particular case, that they're committing violations of human trafficking. And the nice thing about wiretap is it is in real time, right? So you can also get text message information, and with technology advancements, the ability to get some social media correspondence as well. And so the ability to listen in real time not only helps from an investigative standpoint, but it also helps as it relates to developing evidence in the case and moving forward, which we'll get into more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if anyone feels free to throw in the chat, maybe some reasons why you might think a wiretap would be helpful in a human trafficking investigation and prosecution. I think, Nick, you just hit on a couple of them in terms of, we really want to kind of build out that investigation into something that is really many times occurring behind the scenes, right? And so occurring in private. A lot of those means of force, fraud, and coercion, which we're going to discuss in a little bit, are a lot of times happening behind closed doors. So it really helps you to kind of, if you are intercepting those real-time communications and kind of hearing what's happening as it happens, you're able to kind of identify some of those additional targets and victims that you might not have known about, right? Maybe identify some witnesses that you might want to reach out to. And I don't know if this happened to you, but one of the big benefits of a wire is we really were able to identify those additional trafficking operations, because these traffickers really do talk. They still talk a lot, and they still talk to each other, right? They do a lot of communication between each other. And so it really helps you to kind of identify some other possibilities of some operations. And to identify and kind of charge that co-occurring criminal activity, right? So to really hold someone, like you said, accountable for the full aspects of their operations. What other types of co-occurring criminal activity have you heard on, wires and have seen?
Yeah, well, what I'll say, I mean, with us, when we, in our investigations, were going up on wires, they were cases where they were working in different jurisdictions, generally speaking. And so for us, it was important from the point of identifying additional locations, suspects, and victims in our case. In addition, though, a lot of the force, fear, and coercion piece of our case was occurring over the telephone.
Yep.
And so we weren't able to actually see that in real time or have evidence other than to go to a wiretap and be able to listen to it in real time. And again, because we went up on the wiretap, we were able to show that force, fear, fraud, coercion in our cases. And ultimately, we're able to get a prosecution because of the wiretap.
Yeah, and like you said, locating that, you're basically just picking up all sorts of really important other evidence, right? So some of that physical evidence that you might not have known about, and then about for, for when you're doing your takedown, helps you kind of like really build out your surveillance and helps you figure out who you should be watching, and corroborates that witness testimony. And I think that's a really big one, because a lot of times in these cases, which we're going to, kind of talk about as we go through, a lot of the victims are unable to be part of the prosecution and part of the investigation. And so this obviously enables you to kind of hold people accountable without that. But as you go through, and if you hopefully provide the right support, maybe you get people to a place where they do want to be part of that prosecution. And having this wiretap evidence can really, really be hugely helpful to corroborating that witness testimony and taking a lot of that pressure off of the victim testimony to really be the one to prove the case, right? Which I think is, is incredibly an important tool to have. And obviously, hopefully you're able to stop planned criminal activity, right? So whether it's trafficking of further victims, whether it's violence, you're hopefully able to be actually knowing what's happening. And with that knowledge, kind of put a stop to it sooner. I don't know if anyone feels like sharing in your chat. Has anyone used an eavesdropping warrant in your cases? And if so, what type of case was it? And maybe what kind of communications were you getting? I think it'd be really helpful for Nick and I to know kind of if people do have used these before. So feel free to please throw that in the chat as we go along. And, I think we just really want to emphasize at the outstart of this too, that an eavesdropping warrant is a really, really powerful tool. Like we've been talking about, all of that evidence that you can get, but there's a very strong protection to it, right? Because it is a very, very invasive type of warrant. So what types of cases are we thinking about, right? I mean, you're listening to people's real-time conversations, real-time text, photographs, video, all of these things. And we're going to talk a little more about that. But, this is a pretty invasive thing to happen. And so it takes a lot to get there. So, what factors are you kind of considering when you're considering getting an eavesdropping warrant, Nick? What are you kind of thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, for us, really, it came down to how are we going to identify the evidence? And in our cases, we knew they were going to be conspiracy cases. So again, how are we going to be able to identify the other participants in the illegal activity? And in our cases, we found that they're happening over multiple jurisdictions, right? So even outside of Ventura County, although that's where the case originated, we recognized very quickly that the criminal activity isn't just isolated to our jurisdiction. And because of resources, a wiretap allowed us to be able to better understand the criminal organization as a whole throughout the multiple jurisdictions.
Yeah, I think, that size of the operation, like you're talking about, geographic, right? As well as maybe how many victims you think may be part of an operation, right? Some of the labor trafficking cases could have, a really, really large number of victims that are exposed. And like you said, that impact of prosecution, which I think is really important when we're thinking about, okay, is it going to really affect other jurisdictions and other agencies, right? Are you going to be able to bring a much larger case that's going to really kind of have that impact? As well as, like I said before, it might give you leads into other organizations, right? So one of the ones that we worked on, these guys in this one area of Manhattan just kept talking to each other. And so we kind of went from one wire on one to next wire on another guy. And, by the time we had gone and arrested 3 or 4 of these different operations, that stopped. And so, that kind of really put a damper on, they kind of really wised up. And in that area, we really were able to kind of make a difference. So it's something to think about. And then, violence, right? And so I know you and I have kind of had conversations about this, and it's like those cases with that evidence, or with there's, when you think really that there is that evidence of violence that's going on, but you haven't really seen it yet, but for, based on your investigation, you kind of know that that's happening. That may be one that, that might be an investigation that you really are, know that this is, there is this level of violence going on that might be really important to use that extra tool of an eavesdropping warrant to really kind of get evidence of that, to be able to hold that person accountable and stop that violence, right? But I think there's also that other aspect that we've talked about is that, I think some people are sometimes, worried about the, liability issue, or what are we going to find if we, do go up on this wire with violence. And so I know you guys handled that in some cases. How did you guys deal with that when you did get evidence of that violence?
Yeah. So, I mean, for us, the violence piece of it was definitely discussion. I know there was questions as to whether do we go up on a wiretap simply because of that or not. Can we prove the case without a wiretap?
Mm-hmm.
And And really, the ultimate decision for us was, given the scope of the criminal organization in our cases, yes, we need to go up on a wiretap because we can't be at all these places at the same time. So we can't be, for example, in our case, we can't be in Los Angeles and in the Bay Area at the same time while they're conspiring as it relates to the trafficking activity. But a wiretap allows us to get up on and listen to those the conversation regarding the conspiracy of trafficking.
Yeah.
And even if it's down to understanding everybody's role, right? So everybody has a different role in this organization, and a wiretap allowed us to be able to better understand and articulate everybody's specific role within the organization. And I will say, one of the points up on the screen that right now is charges without a wire. That was always a consideration for us as well, because especially when you're talking about trafficking cases, right? So if we're going to go up on a wiretap for just human trafficking, that means that we've got probable cause at this point to go up. Now, what happens if we go up on the wire and we listen, but we don't establish enough evidence for prosecution of human trafficking? Then do we have enough evidence independent of the wire to prove up maybe another charge? And I know we'll get into exhaustion and what that means from a law enforcement perspective later on. But that was also a very important piece in discussing whether a wiretap was a good tool in our investigations before we actually pursued it.
Yeah, really thinking about, okay, if we don't do this, we've done all this investigation, we have this case, what is an eavesdropping warrant going to get us? And do we have charges sufficient, right? Like maybe you do have charges that are sufficient to hold someone accountable and make arrests. And then maybe you think you're going to you have really good reason to believe you're going to get that additional evidence, maybe of that force, fraud, or coercion if you do a search warrant on the phone, right? So that's a possibility. Right. So maybe that's one that you're thinking, okay, we don't need to take that extra step. And, we're going to talk about resources later too, but obviously you want to think about what resources you have available. And the age of the victim is up here, partly because, obviously if there are some really good statutes that allow you to hold offenders accountable for trafficking minor victims. But I do think that, there's this kind of thought process that we focus on this minor victim. And, we've talked a lot about this kind of magic number 18, right? Just because someone turns 18 and they wake up the next day and they're a day older, are they really, any less vulnerable to this trafficking and any less victimized just because they've kind of turned that corner? And so really kind of think about this as a tool to be able to hold someone accountable for, a lot of places you can charge someone with trafficking without having to prove that force, fraud, or coercion element for a minor, right? But so you may not need a wire, if you have minor victims, but really kind of consider the age in that way. And then we talked a little bit about this, what can be intercepted. And obviously this is always changing. So kind of just keep up to date and we can help you kind of figure that out. If you do have specific questions, but obviously, phone calls over landlines, over cell phones, Wi-Fi calls, text messages, any videos or photographs that are being sent. And like you talked about, a lot of that social media communication, you are able to get that real time as long as it's not being sent in a specific encrypted way. And so I found that in a lot of these cases, traffickers are very, very talky and not incredibly stealth with the way they're communicating always. I mean, sometimes, of course, there's WhatsApp involved and WeChat and things of that nature. Believe there may be some inroads being made into WhatsApp messages. And so just kind of keep in mind that this is always changing. So.
Yeah. And I will say too, I mean, obviously when we talk about the landline, the text messages, you can get that stuff in real time. A lot of times social media will be delayed and you may get it in increments of 15 minutes to 30 minutes. Yeah. So something to consider in your operational planning as an investigator. But I'd also love to hear in the chat if there's, because this is changing, it seems like it's changing every day what you have ability to get into. I'd love to hear on chat any other, if you've written wires and you've been able to access other things that we haven't shared, feel free to share what you've been able to write wires for in the chat too, so we can all learn from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've talked about this. Because this is incredibly invasive, right? There is this strict legal standard. So this is an invasion into someone's privacy. And so there is all of these standards. So, we talk about the federal, this is the federal statute. Obviously every jurisdiction is going to be slightly different, but most of them mirror this to most extent, right? So what that legal standard is to get a wire, you need that probable cause to believe that the subject has committed, is committing, or is about to commit an eligible offense. And you need probable cause to show that communications about that eligible offense will be obtained through interception. And then you have to show what we've kind of talked about, this exhaustion. You have to show that normal investigative procedures have been tried and failed, are likely to fail, or would be too dangerous. And so, that's kind of the thing that separates it out from a search warrant. It's kind of like a search warrant plus, right? You need to show all this exhaustion of alternative means. And so really your analysis is you're thinking, is an eligible crime, is there probable cause to believe that eligible crime is being committed? And this is going to be laid out by statute, which we'll talk about in a second. And then communications concerning that offense will be intercepted. And what I would say, we're going to talk a little bit more about what's pertinent and not pertinent. But, I know, Nick, we've talked a lot about how pertinent communications look different in trafficking cases, right? So you obviously are thinking about those more obvious forms of force, fraud, and coercion, but a lot of those communications may be more nuanced. And so we'll kind of get into that. But I think it's also really helpful when, you're writing a wire application, you really want to be educating, not only, they have to be signed generally by the actual DA in an office, right? So I couldn't sign it, our DA had to sign it. Then it has to be approved, or it has to be so it has to be approved by the DA, the elected DA, but then it has to go to a judge, and that judge has to find that there's probable cause. And so I think you really want to make sure that you're laying out in your application a lot of those dynamics of human trafficking and what it looks like and what it is. And you're really educating that, that judge or that magistrate who's going to be taking a look at that warrant. Because then that's going to kind of, set the stage for that person really understanding what's happening in these operations. And then you have to show that, again, like we've talked about, the normal investigative procedures have been tried and failed. So when we talk about eligible offense, this is very statute specific. So it's laid out in these two federal statutes, but each state is going to have a different statute saying what are eligible offenses for a wiretap. And so just, you're going to need to take a look at what's in your jurisdiction. Typically, both sex and labor trafficking, as well as money laundering, exploitation of children, and these organized crime and racketeering charges are usually included. In New York, I know we also had promoting, so we had that slightly lesser trafficking offense, right, without that force, fraud, or coercion, and we were able to get wires for that, but that changed pretty recently. So just make sure you're checking in your jurisdiction. And then necessity, right? So you have to show this is this exhaustion, right? And it is exhausting, right? I mean, so, and it's interesting because you have to lay out kind of what you've done, and then it's failed to get you all the evidence that you need to really kind of show what's happening in this operation and to really prove that case. Or that they're likely to fail, or that they'd be too dangerous. So I don't know, Nick, if you have some thoughts on what kind of some of these are likely to fail and how you kind of lay these out, and some that might be too dangerous in these types of cases.
Yeah. So I mean, when it came to the exhaustion, it's important to point out it didn't change how we handled our investigation, right? I mean, we almost approached it like, if we were to go up on a wiretap, what would we do? Mm-hmm. And that's how we really started our investigation. So we'll do the initial surveillance, we'll do the initial phone tolls, we'll identify target locations to the best of our ability, our suspects and victims in the case. And by going through those steps of bank records and even a pen register, to identify numbers that are being called, to give you a sense of what the wire might look like. Those things you would do or should be doing in a more advanced trafficking case anyways. Mm-hmm. And if you find that you're getting to the point that, listen, I've tried all these law enforcement tools and I'm still not able to prove up the force, fear, fraud, coercion piece of human trafficking, then a wiretap may be appropriate in that, right? And even if it's a short wiretap, that may be appropriate. I
Yeah.
will say with our investigative team, we stayed away from undercover operations. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One, the safety factor. And we would articulate this in the application to the judge.
Yep.
In explaining that for us to do an undercover operation is a safety issue and it's a time issue, right? A lot of times we're just learning about this organization. And if we wanted to try to do an undercover operation, that's a significant amount of resources and work. And so we would articulate that point in our wiretap applications. It was never an issue, right? Because it was just too dangerous.
Yep. And especially, in some cases you might, for instance, like a large scale drug trafficking operation, you may actually try to put an undercover into the operation. Clearly, you're not going to try and do that in these operations, right? You're not going to try and put an undercover to be part of that operation for all of the reasons, that we know, right? Yeah, so we'll talk about this a little bit, but as we kind of get into what you're going to find, but there is some pretty good case law that basically says the purpose of this is not to foreclose electronic surveillance until every other imaginable method has been unsuccessfully attempted, right? So like you said, you don't have to try everything and put it in that you've tried X, Y, and Z, a million different things that you could possibly think of. That's not what's required. It's just required that you show that in your particular investigation, right? So what's important for your specific investigation, you've tried these normal investigative techniques, like you said, right? And you've tried, you've used this normal amount of resources and you've still failed to make the case within a reasonable period, right? So you've tried X, Y, and Z. Maybe you've tried to speak to some of the victims in the case and they don't want to talk to you for all these very understandable reasons, which we'll talk about, right? So, we're kind of, we've kind of talked about this, but, and these are just a few of the things, right? So we've talked about trying to interview people and really kind of see what witnesses are out there and what possible victims. But obviously you have to kind of take considerations of trauma and you have to take considerations of safety into that. And so really be smart about how you're trying to do that, right? You don't want to put your officers in danger and you don't want to put the victims or witnesses in danger by speaking to them. Obviously kind of take a look at these criminal histories, look at other jurisdictions. Like you said, your case had, connections across all jurisdictions. I think, traffickers generally, no matter whether it's labor or sex trafficking, they're moving around a lot. And so there will be other jurisdictions that have information that could be really helpful for you. Look at some of those closed cases, obviously do your surveillance like we're talking about. If someone's been incarcerated at any point throughout kind of this possible operation, listen to those calls and take a look, like you said, those phone records, pen registers, which is that kind of, you can get information about who someone's calling, right? And you don't get the difference in a wire, you get the actual communications. This, you just get who they're communicating with and how often. So it can really give you a real-time layout of that. All the records.
I will say,
yeah.
if I could jump in. So one of the things that that we really focused on, if we had clear evidence that our conspiracy case was occurring in other jurisdictions, we would often put the information in for deconfliction, right? So we would put it into Western States Information Network and ensure that the phone numbers, locations, the individuals that we've identified, their vehicle license plates, anything tangible that we have as it related to the case, we would deconflict and we would put that in. And oftentimes what we would find in these other jurisdictions is that other law enforcement agencies were already investigating or had investigated a portion of the conspiracy. And so that was a huge help for us in asking for those reports as it related to the case. And for the agencies that were willing to participate, it bolstered our resources.
Yeah.
We were able to compare investigative notes as it related to the case. And it really gave us a better understanding of how the criminal organization, was operating before we even got up on the wiretap.
Yep.
And so that's an important piece of that. Is really working with other law enforcement agencies, ensuring that you're deconflicting. Because again, the other piece of that too, we talked about safety a moment ago. If I'm going to go out and do surveillance on this this illicit group that's operating and committing crime, I want to ensure that other law enforcement agencies know that we're out there as well. And so again, the deconfliction helps in a couple of ways. And I mentioned the pen register piece too. And I didn't get into great detail, but I'm going to talk about it right now because I really think this is important for any law enforcement organization that's going to go up on a wiretap. You should always include a pen register warrant before you go up on an actual wire. And the reason for that is you're going to be more efficient when you go up on your wire. The pen register is going to allow you to see the phone numbers that are calling your suspects, right? Or who your suspects are calling. You can do the research on those phone numbers before you ever go up on a wire. And that saves you so much time because then you can really focus on the content of the conversations as opposed to trying to research who's calling who. You'll have that part done.
Yeah, which is incredible. I mean, I'm so glad you brought that up. It's such an incredible, basically you want to have as much information about this organization and operation and who it's like a pen register is like a mini wire, right? It's like a pre-wire.
It is.
Right. And can be really, really helpful. And then you know who these players are and you know, therefore, what's kind of pertinent when we talk about pertinent and non-pertinent, right? When we're talking about pertinent communications are something that's relevant to the wire that you're listening to and recording. Not pertinent is what you're kind of trying to minimize out, which we'll talk about. But I just realized I've been kind of using that language a little bit. So just in case people don't know, but exactly everything you can find out before is really going to help you really make the most of that wire when you're up on it, right?
And I will say too, the financial piece of it too is also important, right?
Yes.
So if you can identify the financial records of your suspects in these cases, you can start to see the connection as well on the money side, right? Because when we're talking about human trafficking, what's the motive for most trafficking cases? It's related to money. And so if you can track financial records, and you can do that through a number of ways, traditional surveillance, the mail cover option is great, which we've done many times with the United States Postal Service. And I'm happy to answer questions about that if you have them. These are techniques that you can employ. They don't take a great deal of time or effort, but could be very rewarding and then help you in your prep for the wiretap.
Yeah, and a lot of them are kind of some of the more safer paper case options, right? Like if you're getting all of your search warrants together and you're identifying, they all build on each other, right? You do search warrants for emails and for whatever phones you made and for social media, and you're then able to identify, okay, these are these bank records that we might need, and then you can get those bank records. And then, mail covers are incredibly helpful because you just see what records they're getting, right? And it kind of gives you an insight into what other financial records, what other areas you might want to get that information from.
And all this leads into your exhaustion, right? So you're going to articulate all of this in your application for the wiretap. And you'll let the judge know, listen, judge, we've done all these steps, right? And this is how far we've gotten in the case, but we're not quite there because we're having a hard time with this final piece or collecting the final evidence or identifying co-conspirators. That's what you're going to articulate in the wiretap application.
Absolutely. So being incredibly organized is also really important because you need to keep all of this straight to be able to keep track of everything you've been doing so that, it's much easier to then write these as you're kind of going along if you kind of are keeping track of big chunks of information that you're getting. I know I used to kind of keep track of like, we're getting this from this, and this is adding to our PC. So I kind of had a running bullet point list of everything. So then when we were ready and we thought we had enough and we wanted to quickly try and do this, wiretap before someone changed jurisdictions or, something changed, right? Because, you want to be able to write it quickly and kind of get up as quickly as you can once you're like ready to do that. Federally, you can write a roving wire. So you can write a federal wire for both a device and a phone number. And so if someone breaks their phone and they get a new device, but keep that phone number, that's okay. Or if someone vice versa keeps the phone, but gets a new phone number, federally, that's okay. I know in New York that was not, so we would have to rewrite, we'd have to come down off the one and rewrite for that new phone number if we'd gone up on the device or vice versa. So you want to make sure you're really organized as much as you can be as you're doing this, because it'll make your life much easier. And then especially in terms of a takedown too, right? We'll talk about that later, but you want to, have everything as organized as you can as you're doing it, because that will save you time. And Nick, I know you talked about undercover operation considerations. This is like a big thing that people are talking about a lot. And I think sometimes judges are like, well, have you done an undercover operation? And then you've spoken to somebody and then they told you everything. And if you did that, you wouldn't need to, get this wire because you'd have this person telling you what happened. And, I think anyone who's done work in human trafficking understands that that's not really the case, right? So, and these operations can be really kind of traumatic and maybe put them in danger, right? If they're seen talking to law enforcement and the trafficker is not okay with that, if they are, losing out on money, right? If they're losing out on making that money that they would be through whatever appointments they're missing, whatever dates, less time spent on their job, that just sets them up to either owe the trafficker more money. And so, like you said, it's not really a legal requirement, right? So it's not really, there's nowhere that says you have to have done undercover operations to exhaust these alternative means. And I think that's typically the way that trafficking operations have been investigated, but you really don't need that for all the other reasons, right? So there's, I think a lot of times people think, I need to prove that commercial sexual activity element of it, right? And so that's why I need to set up the state. That's why I need to do X, Y, and Z. In my opinion, as a prosecutor, I don't think you really need that. I think that there's plenty of other ways you can show that commercial sexual activity is occurring, right? You're going to have ads, you're going to have text messages, you're going to have all sorts of other things. And especially once you're up on a wire, you're going to get all of that and you're going to have that information and you're not going to you definitely don't need it. Yeah. And if you're going to do one, think about how you're going to do it in the most, and this could be we could talk about this for a long time, but think about, there's no way to make it not traumatic for the victim. So really just kind of think about that as you're doing it. I don't know if you had anything else that you wanted to add. I think it was your point of making sure you're really kind of explaining to a judge why it's not going to work, why there's safety issues, and why it's likely to fail, right? And getting you that information that you want.
Yeah, I mean, for our sex trafficking cases that we've investigated, we've never had an issue being able to articulate the evidence as related to the commercial sex piece, and without doing any of the undercover operations.
Right.
It was never there. We have plenty of investigative tools that we can access to be able to show that that's the case. And you mentioned several of them, that those are the things that we would do, and oftentimes that would be the first thing we'd be able to show right away, is that there's definitely commercial sex taking place within the case. It was really, the issue is being able to prove up the force, fear, fraud, and coercion piece, right? That was always the challenge for us.
So, so now you have, let's say you've done a lot of these things, not all of them, but as many as you possibly can to really kind of build that case. You've exhausted all of those investigative leads. You have that probable cause to believe that, one of these eligible crimes is occurring, whether it's, money laundering, one of your organized crime, or whether it's a trafficking crime. Then you kind of think, okay, like now what? Am I going to do this, right? Are we really going to kind of go after this wiretap, right? Now that we have all this. And I think, we've talked about some of the considerations you would think of. We'll talk a little bit more about resources in a bit. But I think what's important is, and it kind of goes along with this investigation being exhausted thing, even through doing all of this, you may have a really good idea of what's going on in an operation, but you still know that there are things that you don't know, right? So you've done this initial investigation, but you have all these identified, like, oh, we've seen a couple other people. We still don't have a phone number or an identity for them, or who's this other person that the traffickers, interacting with, and what are they doing with their money? What are they doing with X, Y, and Z? No matter how good you are at doing these investigations, there are going to be things that you are unable to find out. And so, there is really good case law that just expanding your investigation to really hold someone accountable is okay. So this was a sex trafficking investigation where law enforcement had written for a wire and been able to use an eavesdropping warrant. And they wanted to know, they wrote out and they said, we still don't know where the location of the profits of this criminal activity are. We don't know what those resources are that are used to evade detection, right? So traffickers are really smart at evading law enforcement, right? I don't know if you've have experiences you'd want to share with that, but we get all sorts of information about ways to evade law enforcement. And that's really kind of key to showing that there's this operation and this ongoing conspiracy of sex trafficking or whatever crime it is. And then, like we've talked about, the methods to control used on victims, right? Extent of transportation, so where they were going around the state, and the identity of other possible victims. So the court has found that this was all legitimate reasons for a wiretap. And so really what this is doing is filling in those gaps that you don't know already, and really kind of closes out your case and really creates this like very strong case most of the time, that you can then, prosecute.
Yeah, and I would say too, as it relates to the evasion piece, it's important to articulate that too, again, in your affidavit to the judge.
Mm-hmm.
What techniques are they using, right? Because that'll help bolster your case. That they're doing counter surveillance. When we follow them, they're clearly doing counter surveillance, or they're using coded language when they interact, right? Maybe a witness or victim shares that piece with you as part of the investigation. That's important to articulate, because again, it's another reason why wiretap may be justified in that case.
Absolutely. I mean, there's all sorts of methods they use to say, hey, this, and also with undercover operations, right? Like, hey, there was this undercover operation, this phone number is associated with law enforcement or associated with whoever. They do all sorts of things to try and evade that law enforcement. So it just says that it is completely legitimate to expand an ongoing investigation, reveal that full scope of the criminal enterprise, even when you have some evidence from those traditional. So it's not saying you have to, clearly you have to have, this is pretty obvious, right? You have to have some evidence to be able to show that probable cause part. But I think some people think, oh, we've gotten a bunch of evidence and, it's really just to kind of get this few other additional things, which maybe we can get later. But this is a completely legitimate and very proper use of an eavesdropping warrant, is to really fill those gaps. And so once you're up on a wire, if you've made that decision and you're going up on a wire, you kind of have this balancing act, right? You want to make sure you are in compliance with that warrant, because it is a really invasive warrant. And the way that you are, doing that kind of lays the foundation for the admissibility of the evidence later. You want to make sure that you're doing as much right as you can. And we'll talk about this, because there's no point in collecting all this evidence if then for some reason it's precluded later. But you also want to make sure you're intercepting these really important communications and preserving that evidence of the crime. So it's kind of like this balancing act you're on all the time. And so one of the main ways we do that is minimization, which is a really big aspect of this, I think, Nick. And so, this is kind of the statutory legal basis. So every eavesdropping order shall be conducted in such a way as to minimize the interception of communications not otherwise subject to interception. So basically, that's a way of saying you don't want to be listening to conversations that aren't part of the criminal activity and are not pertinent. But it doesn't forbid interception of non-pertinent conversations. It just requires a reasonable effort to minimize those interceptions. And so as we talk, just kind of a little bit of the legal basis, what you guys are doing in the wire room as law enforcement and what you're kind of listening to and not listening to, which we'll get into a little bit of the practical in a second. But a judge ultimately is going to be saying, defense attorney is going to say they weren't reasonable. They didn't do this correctly. These should all be thrown out. All of this communication shouldn't come in. And what the prosecutor is just going to have to argue is that what law enforcement was doing is reasonable and it's analyzed in light of the totality of the circumstances and the context of the entire wiretap. So it's not going to be as nitpicky. They're going to kind of take a look at the way in which you do this. But it's you just have to be reasonable, and you have to take steps to show and argue that you were reasonable in what you were listening to. And you're held to a standard of honest effort, and clearly you're not going to be perfect, and it's not legally required. So it's all back to this kind of reasonable standards. And so when we talk about minimization, what are we kind of talking about? What are some of these reasonableness factors? This was a drug conspiracy case, but they're talking about you have a little bit more latitude to intercept communications when there's this coded language, this spot and there's spot checking, and you're submitting progress reports to the court. So you mentioned coded language earlier. Talk a little bit more about that if you wouldn't mind, Nick, because I think that's incredibly important to think about as you're listening to these communications on a trafficking operation, because they're all so unique and they're all going to be, slightly different in what you're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, in each wiretap that we were up on, each of the organizations were using their own language, and it may not have been intentional coded language where they're trying to hide what they're doing to potential law enforcement listening in on the conversations. This may be the way they speak, right? So they have their own language that they've, because of their operation, they kind of use shorthand in the way they talk to each other. And it's really important to really spend the first day or two understanding that language they're using, right? Because you're not going to know the language, or you may not know the language when you go up on the line. And so you want to listen, work with your phone monitors, and if it's in another language, your linguist, to really understand what's being said and apply what's being said to what you know about the case.
Yeah.
And then you can further support that with surveillance, right? Using physical surveillance to show, okay, when they say this, they do this.
Yep.
And by using those techniques, then in a progress report to the judge, so for example, in California, every 10 days, we have to submit a report to the judge about what we're hearing on the line. We can articulate by that point, Your Honor, they're saying these things. We know that it means this because we did surveillance and saw when they said this, they did this. Or we know that when they said this on this line, we received a call and they did this. Those types of things take place. And you really kind of have to, it's kind of a dance, right? Where you get up on the line out, you're quickly learning a new language. Everybody in the wire room is learning this new language. And then you're putting that information so you can educate the judge, who's ultimately going to make the decision line by line on whether you stay up on it or not.
Yep, exactly. And I think, we'll talk about spot checking as we get into minimization, but that's another way where you can start to listen to a conversation. And if it seems like it's not pertinent, you can stop, and then you can turn it back on again to see if they've started talking about something pertinent. So there's kind of ways in which around this, but I think, your point with the progress reports is really important too, because you're really kind of laying out that this is what we're learning about this organization that we didn't already know. And the combination with the surveillance is so key to really be able to, we'll talk about how that becomes even more important later as well, but kind of really, you want to be making sure that when you're listening to something, what's happening in the outside real world, right? And so what are we listening for? Very simply, we're listening to relevant communications, right? So obviously we want the elements of the crime. We're looking for identities of the offenders, if there's other offenders we didn't know, or there are additional offenders, right? So if we're starting to intercept communications between different traffickers and running different operations, or in a large scale operation, you're identifying other individuals who are helping to run that operation and really kind of trying to lay out the land, like you said before, of like, who's doing what's the level of culpability here? And you're starting to think about how does this all work, especially if it's a conspiracy case. But even if not, you're starting to think about what charges you're kind of building towards. And obviously identities of additional victims and possible witnesses you might want to talk to once you're off the wire. The location of evidence and criminal activity, right? You're going to find out all sorts of information about where these crimes are occurring. They may be occurring in places you didn't know about already. And you're going to find out where they're keeping those proceeds, right? Whether they're keeping the evidence of that crime that ultimately you're going to want to get a search warrant for and recover all that evidence as part of your case. And then, like we talked about, this evidence of evading law enforcement. So those are kind of like the really big buckets, I think. But then, like you and I have kind of, talked a lot about, really, we're thinking about this for human trafficking, right? These elements of the crime, this act, means, and a purpose, right? So all of these are acts that go towards human trafficking, right? So when we're thinking about what you can be listening for on the wire, you can be listening to all of this. So any sort of recruitment for jobs, any sort of harboring. So, keeping someone somewhere, transporting them, getting someone for it, advertising, right? And so anything that you do to like maintain that person in it. So which we'll talk about is, generally through the means. And then all of these kind of other things that go along with trafficking, like the solicitation and the patronizing. So all of that really gives you a very wide range of things you can listen for in terms of this act. And obviously then you're listening for that purpose, for the commercial sex, forced labor, forced services, whatever it may be in your case. But then this means is really kind of, I think, where like the crux of this comes in, and where things are very different in a trafficking wire than in some other wires that you'd be listening to, right? Because there is this element of force, fraud, and coercion. And so I think we're going to break that down a little bit and just kind of have a conversation about what are the means of force, fraud, and coercion, right? And if you have a lot of experience in trafficking, you'll have a better understanding of this. But if not, and I keep learning new methods of means, right? Every time I hear about another case or it's really kind of talking about not exhaustive. It's really just kind of mind blowing how many means of force, fraud, fear, coercion there are. And so you really want to think about things that might come up that are a little different are kind of this manipulation. So a lot of this manipulation and isolation that can occur really, really kind of in a very nuanced way and in a very specified way. Each trafficker has their own way of manipulating and isolating victims based on that person's specific vulnerabilities, right? So if it's someone who is, more worried about seeing other individuals be hurt, then that manipulation might be, if you don't do X, then I will hurt, this other individual, not necessarily you, but this other person. Or, if you don't do what I'm asking you to, I'm going to tell, people back home or people where, just shame you. And I'm going to let people know what's happening. And I'm going to call your mom, or I'm going to call whoever it might be, if there's that person in the, and so a lot of that is, a little more nuanced, but then, there's this kind of, element of this like love and this loyalty. And so a lot of these conversations you're going to be listening to, may seem like they're kind of relationship based, right? So it's kind of, it's two people talking about their relationship, and it may not be blatantly obvious that they're talking about trafficking, but that relationship and that relationship of love and that relationship of, that manipulation, that kind of manipulation through feelings of love and loyalty and family, that to me are the ones that are the hardest to kind of, make sure that those are getting intercepted, because they are relevant to this force, fraud, and coercion.
Yeah, and I really love this slide, because I think as investigators and prosecutors, this is really at the end of the day what we're seeking. How do we show the means in this case? Mm-hmm. Right? We're wanting to prove human trafficking, and this is what we always get stuck on. And I think, and again, this is me speaking personally, early in my career, I missed a lot of these. I assumed that, well, we're not intercepting violence, so clearly we're not showing the means. Well, there is so much more that I missed in these cases. And it is nuanced, like Jen mentioned. And you really have to listening to these phone calls, be able to articulate these different points, the isolation piece. Are the victims interacting with other people other than in, for example, our case, the commercial sex customers that were coming, or the traffickers in our case? Who is the victim contacting outside of the trafficking organization? Mm-hmm. Right? When you look at the conversations that are taking place, what forms of manipulation are you able to pick up on? And they may be very nuanced, and it may take several phone calls to articulate what that manipulation is. Yeah. But again, that's why listening to these calls in totality is so important, and not hinging on just one call to be the call that makes your case, right? because that's not always going to be what happens. It may be a totality of the calls that you want to highlight the manipulation piece or the forced criminality piece.
Mhm.
You know, why is your victim committing crime?
Yep.
They're being forced to do so. So really focusing on this when you're up on the wire is crucial in proving your trafficking case. And I really encourage you to really understand the means that you believe is taking place before you get up on a wire, so that you can be laser focused on this when you are.
Yep, absolutely. And some of that recruitment in terms of, recruiting, some of that recruitment might look incredibly, either be very deceptive in terms of what they're asking that individual or saying what that individual is going to be doing. And that's a little more obvious, but it also may be recruitment playing on, that vulnerability of wanting love or wanting to feel, part of something and wanting to feel some, part of a family, right? That's a big thing that, specifically with sex trafficking, that happens a lot, but that recruitment's going to be there, and it may sound nicer than you would expect, right? Because that's how it works. And then deception of consequences, right? So, there's a lot of someone may not get in trouble for something they expected to get in trouble for, right? Or they may comply with something and still get in trouble. So kind of thinking about, some of that as you go through and listen. So, we're talking about what might we intercept in a sex trafficking investigation, and then maybe what might we intercept in a labor trafficking investigation. Practically what you're listening for are, things that are, kind of a little more obvious, right? Like communicating about dates or job arrangements, but making sure you're really kind of, some of those job arrangements and labor trafficking may not be so obvious, or it may be, you just want to make sure you're listening for all of that, so you're really getting the full extent of what's happening. We saw a lot of micromanaging and rules in ours, and, things that you wouldn't normally think of as, that manipulation or that isolation or that kind of just establishing power over somebody, right? So we had people texting to ask if they could spend $10 to go, get their nails done, or if they could wear sneakers instead of high heels, or if they could get, a sandwich as opposed to a salad. And so a lot of that, you kind of think, well, that's just, I don't know, that's not really pertinent. That's not really something, but that's evidence of that micromanaging and those rules. And so that's really important to kind of be thinking about. The emotional pleas, right? So and this is related to kind of those hopes and dreams, right? And so these are kind of more those relationship conversations we were kind of talking about, right? Where, you're going to get the trafficker saying, oh, like, we're just doing this for our family and we're doing X, Y, and Z. And it may seem like it's a plea towards that loyalty and towards that love and towards that feeling of belonging. And then obviously degrading and humiliating comments, name calling, all of that is evidence of that coercion and that force and that fraud and that isolation and that establishing kind of that shame and making someone feel like they don't really have a way out. And there's a lot of that. And then I know financial communications, right? That's something that was really important to your case.
Yeah, the financial piece was nice. I mean, in one of our cases in particular, they would literally text the bank information to the victims and say, deposit money here. And so that's a great way to show movement of money, right? So we know that commercial sex is taking place. We know these victims are being forced to stay in these motel rooms and they're being isolated. There was a lot of micromanaging and rules associated with that. And then the back end, the financial piece, we're seeing the money go from the victims in our case to the suspects in our case. And the only way we were able to show that, again, was through the wiretap, because otherwise we wouldn't know that was taking place. So the text messages in that one particular case became crucial.
Yep. And so kind of just some general keys to success while you're up on the wire, right? Communication is so important, and communication amongst, prosecutor, law enforcement, kind of really having that understanding of what those expectations are before you go up on a wire is incredibly important, so that everyone's on the same page of what your expectations are for what's going to happen daily in the wire room, for, communication of information, and then also for what's going to happen if something emergent comes up, which it will. Who are you going to call? Who does that, what are your protocols you have in place for that? The wire room setup, which we'll talk about for in a minute, but really you want to have make sure you have a dedicated space. And we'll talk about a few more specifics about that, but plan for emergent situations, right? So Nick, I know you guys had like a kind of like a very specific plan for what was going to happen, right? And based on what you start to hear on your wire, that may change, right? And you may say, okay, this sounds like something really bad's about to happen. What are we doing? And instead of having to call 700 people, you really have kind of like a baseline understanding from that communication of like, this is how we're going to handle the situation when we hear violence. We're going safeties first, and we're going to handle it, right? And to really be prepared to do that.
Correct. Yeah. So it's important, again, before you go up on a wire, to talk about, we would call them red flags. So what are going to be red flags? If we intercept a phone call and, for example, a victim is being robbed, or there's some type of violence happening on the lines, what's our contingency plan and how are we going to address that immediately? And so for us, often what that would look like is, you know, when you're going up on these lines, we know where the phone is located, right? So we know the location, and we're going to send law enforcement resources, medical resources immediately to that location, even at the risk of sacrificing the wiretap or the case. If we knew that there were juveniles in the case, that was a red flag for us. We were immediately going to the location, and we were going to make contact with the victim in that case. Again, even if it compromises the rest of the case. So there's got to be these conversations about what red flags look like. And I highly encourage that it not just be the investigative team, but it also be the prosecutor in your case. That everybody has a say in what that looks like. And also everybody understands what's going to happen. And that communication is relayed to everybody when it happens. And that can even be a text message, phone call to the group, you know, the kind of the core group of investigators, prosecutors. And this is happening, this is what we're doing, and I'll keep you updated type thing, something simple like that. And then as you go up on the wire and you're listening, like Jen mentioned, there may be other potential red flags that you're going to have to plan for. You know, this could happen. What are we going to do if it does?
And I think a lot of this also relates to, you know, when we talk about this kind of knowledge about the case and minimization, right? It's so important to make sure that you are being reasonable in your minimization, right? You're only listening to conversations that are pertinent, and that's going to depend so much on your knowledge of the case. So this kind of understanding what specifically is happening in each case, what that coded language is, who the players are, and really making sure everyone who's involved in that has an understanding, right? And you know, your designated roles and responsibilities, you may have a plant manager, your person who's managing the case, be that person who knows the most about the case, but sometimes the people that are listening to the calls are not necessarily going to be those people. So really that knowledge of the case, and this kind of goes to the wire room setup, right? You want to make sure that eavesdropping warrant is displayed, because that's going to show you're reasonable and you're all in understanding of what that is. What those important phone numbers and photos are. So photos of the targets, photos of the victims, such that you have them in really kind of the, like, you know, the players who are involved, and then also those privileged individuals. So if they're talking to a lawyer, like, you make sure you have that number up there so you know that you're not, you know, listening to those conversations. You want the prosecutor's information, and those minimization instructions. So when you're going through and saying, hey, this is what this human trafficking case looks like, this is what these means we think are going to happen, all of that, you kind of have, like, we had everybody actually have to sit through a training on that, sign minimization instructions, and those were up on the wall. So just kind of some like technical ways you can do it. And then, you know, when we're talking about maximizing resources, I think sometimes, you know, going up on a wire can seem daunting in terms of, wow, it's going to take a lot. It's going to take all these resources, but really there are ways you can kind of maximize those.
Right. And I will say with us, I mean, there were two full-time investigators, myself and one other, that were handling trafficking in the county, trafficking cases. And so when we were going to go up on a wire, we needed help, right? We obviously weren't going to do it by ourselves. And a lot of that was working with our, you know, leaning on our narcotics team to help out with surveillance, leaning on our intelligence team to help staff the wire room, leaning on our district attorney's office to help out with the financial piece of the case. And again, leveraging those relationships that you have with other law enforcement agencies that specialize in some of the skills you need for your case.
Yep.
That makes it a lot easier to manage and allows the case agents, and so in our case, 2 of us, to be able to really hyper focus on managing the case, right? Instead of having to worry about surveillance, financials, we would manage the case and keep it moving forward.
Yeah, and I think prioritizing your targets, right? How many lines can you go up on, figure out who's really the most important and go from there. Just quick on takedown preparation. So you just want to make sure you're writing all the time and you're kind of keeping track of all this so that you know what search warrants, you're going to want to execute so that if something emergent does happen, you are kind of prepared to the extent you can be. Or whether it's a very planned takedown. Just want to make sure you're aware of those discovery requirements. Obviously happy to help anyone with, some of the more technical aspects of this, but you are going to have to notify people who are intercepted over the wire. Think about some of those sealing and unsealing orders you might need to be able to turn over that information and those calls, and consider what you're turning over. So if you have another investigation that might be ongoing, let's say you have one trafficker who's talking to another one, and you're starting another investigation, think about a protective order to protect some of that information, or victim safety obviously can be very important, and what you want to not turn over right away. And you're going to have that Brady kind of that exculpatory disclosures, probably in a lot of your cases, if you're talking to victims, there's going to be, initially, which we're going to talk about right now, when, preparing for victim contact, because that's so important, but you're really kind of ripping the rug out from underneath somebody in a lot of these cases. And whether, we believe we're going in there and stopping, bad behavior and criminal activity and some violence and bad abuse, you are really going to have to need to understand what those victims are going to be going through and try to do this in the most trauma-informed way that you can, right? So, and generally, we're not expecting someone to cooperate, and we'll talk about this in a second, but really, we're not expecting that, victim who is immediately going to say, oh, let me disclose everything that's happened to you or happened to me, and thank you so much. That's just probably not going to happen. And so I know, Nick, all of these things that are listed on here are so important, but I think you guys even had a separate debriefing. You had one for the tactical and then one for the approach to the victims. So I think that's really, really important for people to hear about.
Yeah, it is absolutely crucial, especially in trafficking cases, that you work with your service providers, because they are also an additional resource who are experts in an area that you're going to need in your cases. And so when we planned for our takedown, well, one, let me back up. When we were starting our case, we let our service providers know, listen, we're starting this case. This is the type of crime that we believe is taking place based on initial evidence. These are the types of victims that we believe we're going to come in contact with. For our cases, a lot of Mandarin speaking from China or Taiwan. They're in the country without status, expired visa, seeking political asylum. So that our service providers can prepare, because they need to, just like us, they need to prepare as well. So that is an important part of this as well. And then for the takedown, having a briefing with our service providers and dedicating linguists in our cases. And in our case, the FBI was a huge help in providing special agents at each of the locations that we thought we were going to come in contact with victims, and letting them know, this is step-by-step what we expect from you. And this is how the contact with the victim at the location should look like, so that everybody was clear. They had an opportunity to ask questions before they deployed on the takedown, right? It's very well planned out, thought out, and our service providers took the lead on that as far as what that looked like. So that is a crucial part of any case, especially when you're talking about a large case that involves a wiretap.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the extent you can kind of say, certain individuals may have had contact with victims before and may be more comfortable with them. If you can provide kind of that trauma-informed peer support, peer support can be incredibly helpful. And, we can kind of help try and find that but someone who's kind of lived through the experience of trafficking can maybe be in a really important kind of conduit to kind of bridge that gap, but really making sure you are ready to provide those services and not necessarily expect those services to be taken up on, but really have a plan for kind of following up and trying to, be honest and transparent and trustworthy and everything. And, just a really quick conversation on, this barriers to reporting. There are so many reasons why victims of trafficking, labor, and sex trafficking are unable to kind of report and really be part of a prosecution. There's this inherent distrust, both of anyone who's other, right? The traffickers have been telling them forever that anyone outside of their world is other, and anyone who's not in the life is other. Anyone who's not part of what's happening is other and can't be trusted. There's a lot of shame, especially we talked about kind of that forced criminality. If there's a lot of forced criminality going on, whether it's kind of forced complicity in parts of the trafficking operation, whether it's other crimes, there's a lot of shame in that. So much trauma that goes on in these cases. One of the our advisory council who we work with on another project called Just Exits, described one time this one interaction she had with a buyer, and was just like, that is 1 out of 10 different people I saw in one night of 7 nights a week, 7 days, or 7 days a week, every week for 10 years. And it just kind of really hits home the trauma that is being inflicted upon these individuals. Those feelings of love and loyalty, right? They may feel very bonded to the trafficker. They may not have resources that they need, right? Whether it's financial, home, education, any other options, right? So they may feel that this is really where they are and don't feel that there's any, that there's strong enough support for them. And then those cultural factors, right? That we've kind of talked about in a lot of these cases. And this, just to mention, this distrust for law enforcement is like really, really ingrained. Traffickers say, you can't trust law enforcement. And then, a lot of times victims of trafficking have some sort of interaction with law enforcement or with authorities of some case, some sort, that just reinforces that. And so then it's just making the trafficker kind of this omnipotent person. And so all of these things are reasons why we just kind of need to really have in our heads, okay, what are these barriers in the cases, and try to do everything we can to just have the patience to keep minimizing those barriers. And I think patience is really, really key in that. And so just to have this kind of conversation is wiretapping trauma-informed and victim-centered, right? I mean, it's a conversation you can have. And I think there are some, benefits, right? So if we're thinking about, trying to hold people accountable for really horrible crimes without relying on, that victim testimony and relying upon that participation by the victim, this can be a really, really great tool to do that. As long as you really are employing this kind of, I know we've talked about this a lot, any interaction with law enforcement is going to be traumatic, any interaction with the criminal justice system, there's just no way for it not to be. So really, how do you minimize that? And I think a lot of what you talked about with your takedowns is, your planning is so important, right? And really, I think, providing this non-judgmental assistance and allowing this like self-determination for, and allowing people to make informed choices. So telling them what choices they have and really kind of listening to what those particular needs in a case are, and doing it in a really non-judgmental fashion, right? So, and just making sure that their rights and their voices, their perspectives are occurred. And a lot of this can be done if you really can find that peer support, and find individuals who are, have that lived experience and are willing to kind of work with law enforcement and be connected with victims as you come across them, can be a really great way to bridge that. I've seen that be really a wonderful way to bridge that gap and really help someone understand that someone was maybe where they were, and then we're able to kind of, build a life afterwards, right? So really, I think the whole point of this is we really just want to make sure that you're really thinking about this trauma-informed approach and recognizing that it's going to be traumatic, and what can you do to make it the least traumatic as possible, and really not see yourself as going in there as, rescuing and being the savior, because that's not necessarily how you're going to be seen. But you want to really kind of just keep being patient and trustworthy, and really try and build those relationships.
And Jen, if I might, I will say too, a lot of that as an investigator and prosecutor, as you work up to a wiretap, you have a lot of control on how victim-centered and trauma-informed your case is. And I gave the example of having a separate briefing with service providers,
Absolutely.
but also in the way that you go up on the lines, for example. So one of our focuses was on the suspects in our cases. So we were very suspect focused as it related to the criminal case, meaning that the evidence that we would try to obtain was centered around the suspects in our case, not the victim, but the suspects in our case, or suspects. And the same thing when we went up on lines, we focused on going up on suspect lines, so that the evidence that we were gathering was focused on what are the suspects doing in the case. And inherently, they're going to be in contact with victims. That's going to be a part of it. But really, that we're really focused that way, so that the victim isn't left having to testify in court as it relates to, what they've done in the case, or to the statement they gave to law enforcement. So again, how you tailor a case, whether it's a wiretap or not, makes a big difference in the victim's involvement. And a victim may or may not want to be involved. And again, that's a consideration, and it should be up to the victim and what they want to do. If they don't want to be involved in the case, then tailor your case so that you really minimize how much they are involved.
Yeah, so they don't have to be. Exactly. And I think you made such a good point about, I think so many times in cases, we look at what did the victim do or not do, or, all of these things, and we're focused on their actions or their non-actions. And instead it's like, well, no, we really need to be focusing on what the offender did, because the offender, what their tactics are is causing the victim to act the way that they are, or to respond the way that they are. Right. And so focusing, that's such an incredibly important point, is focusing on what that offender behavior is so important. We've talked about some of this, but we really kind of want to make sure that, you're using your wire, if you're up on it, to make sure that, like you said, you really can kind of proceed with cases without a victim's participation, and understanding that there may be harm while the investigation's ongoing, and how you deal with that. And sometimes you may know about it, sometimes you may not, right? And so just to kind of always keep that in the back of your mind, that that's happening. And like you said, the victim's communication is probably going to be intercepted without their consent. And so that's a big trust hurdle to get over. And so having that kind of patience and that understanding of that, just having that understanding is really important. I think any of us would be jarred by that. So like we've talked about, you want to use wires judiciously, collaborate with the victim services, strategize those post-wire approaches, and define when you take down an operation, how you're going to do that. So just to kind of give a brief introduction into kind of what you then do with all of this evidence, because, you may get evidence very quickly, right? So that's the other thing to consider with resources. You may plan to be up on a wire for a long time, and you may be up for less than 30, maybe 60 days. And you're going to get probably, if you've done your investigation right and really believe that there's a trafficking operation, you're probably going to get that evidence that you need pretty quickly. And so then what do you do with this evidence once you get it? We want to make sure that we're able to admit these communications at trial, because ultimately, if that's where it goes, you want to make sure that you're not having done all this work to then not have them admitted. So some of this is you're going to take a look at those statements that you're intercepting over the wire and look at those for admissibility. And you're going to argue, the prosecutor is going to argue for all of these different hearsay, for all these different statements to be introduced at trial. And then you also want to think about how you're going to explain the evidence to the jury, to the fact finder, to the judge, right? And so you're going to want to think about who you're going to call as witnesses, and especially if you have a victim that's unable to participate. So think about who else you're going to be calling, and think about possibly using an expert to kind of explain some of this. So very briefly, hearsay, out of court statement that's offered to prove the truth in the matter asserted. And so a lot of that is going to be what you're getting. You're going to have a lot of out of court statements. And so you're going to think about what are these common hearsay exclusions that you can use, right? So this is not, a list of everything, but these are the ones that are really going to be important in trafficking cases as you're intercepting wires, right? You're going to get a lot of admissions by your suspects, by your defendants. Co-conspirator statements we're going to talk about in a minute, because this is kind of the bread and butter of how you're going to get a lot of these statements in. And I think it blew both of our minds a little bit when we started digging into this. So, and then prior consistent statements. So if you're, for instance, just a very brief, if you're, if the victim is making statements over the wire or has made statements to you, and then the defense says that they have a motive to lie, as long as that statement was made before that motive to lie happened, you can admit those prior consistent statements at trial. So happens a lot with, immigration consequences and someone saying that they are, lying for immigration consequences, and you can say no before they even knew that that was a thing. This is what they were saying. They were still having these consistent statements with what they said at trial, or what was said on the wire. So statements made by, so the statement of co-conspirator, I think, is a really important one to kind of break down a little bit. And statements of co-conspirators are made by the defendant's co-conspirator. They are not hearsay and are admissible against the defendant if they are made during the course of the conspiracy and in furtherance of the conspiracy. So those are the two things you have to show, is that they were made during the course of the conspiracy and that they were in furtherance of the conspiracy. And I think when we talk about, during the course of the conspiracy and in furtherance of the conspiracy, in furtherance of the conspiracy could be quite a few different things, right? And a lot of it is, communications between the defendant and the victim, kind of telling them what to do, where to go. But a lot of these things we were talking about, right? Like that manipulation, and he's trying to further that conspiracy of trafficking. And he's doing it by, kind of appealing to that love, appealing to that, those more nuanced forms of manipulation. You may get interactions and communications between victims to each other. So text messages between victims amongst the organization, talking about the operation or talking about what the defendant has said to them or done to them. So just kind of thinking about conversations with buyers, conversations on how to invade law enforcement, all these things we've talked about are really kind of in furtherance of that conspiracy. And you don't have to charge conspiracy. You may want to charge conspiracy for all sorts of reasons, but to argue these statements come in, you don't have to have a conspiracy charge in your case. The co-conspirator does not need to be charged. So this is the one that I had a really hard time wrapping my head around. And I know you, Nick, we've talked a lot about this, that, you're going to, and this is whether it's something that you have discerned from your investigation and that you're saying this person's a victim of a crime, even if they are immune from prosecution, right? So this case in California where it involved minor victims of the crime, so they couldn't even be possibly conspirator, guilty of this crime, they're immune from prosecution, they still are considered co-conspirators. So this is really, really kind of an important thing to keep in mind in your cases when you're thinking about this, and really will be applicable. And I think, we're happy to discuss if you have specific statements that come up or things in your cases, but I think this co-conspirator statements is really, kind of where the bread and butter of a lot of your statements are going to come in. Very quickly, just kind of proving that ongoing conspiracy, because you're going to have to prove that there is that ongoing conspiracy. This is where everything we've talked about already comes in, right? You can introduce evidence of all of these different things to show that there's that conspiracy ongoing. And this is kind of really just exhaustion of alternative means in, another framework, right? Solicitation is a verbal act. So this is a case out of Oregon where actual online advertisements could come in and they are not hearsay, they are a verbal act. And some other ones that might apply in your cases: present sense impressions, excited utterances, someone talking about their existing mental, emotional, physical condition, that will happen a lot in these cases. And then if you do have statements made for medical diagnosis or treatment, just kind of think about that. And that's something that you should be, I know you mentioned that, but you really should be making sure that that's something that's available to victims in your cases, not just, an exam if you believe that they need to see a forensic nurse or things of that nature, but really just general medical care should be really available. There may be other ones like effect on the listener, rule of completeness, res gesti, so statements that are part of the crime. And so a lot of these things you're going to be piecing together, but it's going to be really, really important to just make sure that as you go through your evidence and as you're thinking about what has been intercepted, you're thinking about, okay, this is going to come in for this reason, and really kind of have all these and argue as many as are applicable, right? Because you really want to make sure that you get all of these statements as statements in. And then I think, we've talked a lot about how expert witnesses can be really helpful in these cases, because especially if it is a case where you have a victim who's unable to participate. I think, we've both seen probably cases where juries want to care about a case and they want to know why they should care. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes they can see this and say, oh, well, if the victim's not here testifying, then why do I care? Right? I don't know, Nick, if you've seen that ever, but I feel like that's something that you want to make sure that you're explaining this very nuanced evidence. And especially if you don't have the victim, and even if you do, if you have a victim that's able to participate, think about maybe using an expert to kind of get past some of these. But you're going to start with your opening statement. You're really going to be educating the jury when you start voir dire. You're going to be doing that. Think about what witnesses to call, right? I would have loved to have Nick as a witness in a lot of my cases to call to kind of give that background of like, here's what this trafficking, there are these dynamics of trafficking, and this is what it looks like. And this is what we saw in this case, right? But then when we're thinking about expert testimony, all of these things are why it's really important, right? We want to provide context. We may be able to explain to the jury why the victim's unable to participate. It might help the jury understand some behavior that they might not understand, especially in a wiretap. If they're hearing a lot of this really horrible evidence of the means, they're going to have questions as to why that person didn't leave, and kind of these myths and misconceptions, right? So it dispels a lot of those, and that's really important for expert testimony. So, it has been admissible. It's someone who's their knowledge or skill or experience or training, they can testify. If it will help the trier of the fact to understand the evidence or determine a fact and issue. So it's been upheld, and we have plenty of case law if you're interested, but basically allowed to testify about things such as means used to target, recruit, manipulate victims, maintain victims, contributing factors that make victims vulnerable that we all kind of are very well aware of. This kind of finesse pimping, which we've talked about, that's like the more subtle and the more appeal to that love and that coercion. And then the kind of subculture and the vernacular that is involved in the life. And just when you're thinking about it, think about whether you want to call someone who is academic and credentialed, or many times I think it actually is really helpful to call someone who has that anecdotal or experiential involvement, maybe some of your service providers, of course, no one that's directly involved with the case, but someone who's worked with victims and kind of has that understanding. And if you have a police officer who's really, or an investigator in your case, who's really kind of has the context for this, they can testify, and sometimes they may be a fact and expert witness. Sometimes they may be an expert witness. But again, this is something we can get into if it's something that comes up in your case. We have plenty of resources on that. And really just to appeal to the prosecutors out there, you really kind of, these are the things that you can really make a difference in, and wiretapping can be one of them, right? So you can really collaborate with a lot of people and really try to work, like Nick said, with multiple jurisdictions and all sorts of individuals to really kind of hold these really horrific offenders accountable for everything they're doing. They're masters at being able to avoid detection and avoid being held responsible. So this can be a way really to do it. Make sure you are that kind of convener of bringing your service providers together and be that conduit to the services, and really kind of think about ways you can make change, right? We talked about the impact in these cases, right? And ways you can make an impact. And so really think about how a wiretap could really help you do that in these cases, and I'm happy to discuss that more. But really, I think both Nick and I really want to kind of encourage you to think about utilizing wiretaps. Don't be scared of them. Use them appropriately and in the right cases, and really kind of make sure you're kind of thinking about, you're leveraging those resources to get that evidence to support victims and survivors. And again, we're happy to have lengthier conversations with you about specific cases. And then think about maybe using experts to really kind of make sure that juries are really understanding all of that really, really important and evidence that you're gathering in your case. So my information is here, as is Nick's. We have a bunch of special initiatives through Equitas. Just Exits is the one I was speaking of. We have a bunch of resources pertaining to human trafficking. We have a bunch of other webinars and resources for our field-generated human trafficking grant through OVC. There's some wonderful OVC-funded resources that are really kind of helpful. And again, just some additional resources for you. So And we do have office hours, Equitas, every month. So reach out and we can give you information about that. So thank you all for your time. Nick, I don't know if you want to jump in with any other.
No, I would just say that, obviously a lot of information shared in the last 90 minutes, and please don't hesitate to reach out to Equitas or myself if you have follow-up questions or you're currently working a case and issues come up. Happy to help in any way that we can.
Yep. And there's an evaluation in the link. If you wouldn't mind, if you have some time to fill that out, that would be in the chat. I think that would be really helpful. And thank you so much, everybody.